Laying on a couch in the dark, smoking a cigarette, Lenny felt old in his madman's dream. The continuity of his life had snapped 1,000 times, and all that remained was the rage and the over-30 reunion soccer game. For the past couple of weeks, Lenny had cranked on the old dirt bike, trying to cut down on his drinking. He'd even started to sketch a little, hoping the muse might be kind. After all, he had once considered himself an artist, until he'd given up hope. Then he thought of her again, like he had every day for the last 12 friggin' years. She was the complete picture in a broken frame. Frail and strong, right, but wrong. Crippled as a kid in a car accident, she had fought her way back through constant pain. There had never been another woman that had come close to her grace. They'd had a beautiful child who he hardly ever saw. Lenny and his bride had named her Dandelion. She was a drummer in a punk band and lived in a house, communal house, with a bunch of kids with different colored hair. She truly loved her old man, but she was kind of just a soft thought on the back burner of his mind. The twisted side of his divided self had finally turned his bride inside out. Things became horribly sordid, and their lover's world came crashing down. She began lying with frequent regularity. His company was made to feel burdensome, as she listened attentively to swines who wouldn't sacrifice the time of day for her once their craving was fulfilled. Lenny still wanted her desperately, yet her wanderings left him with an anger he couldn't control. One time, after she'd been gone a couple of days, he put his hand in one of her coat pockets, feeling a couple of packages with the tips of his fingers. A container of condoms and vaginal cream lay in his palm like DNA in a murder case. He'd had a vasectomy years ago, so he knew these little birth control accoutrements were not meant for his Christmas stocking. Shortly thereafter, she had flown into the arms of Danny Kidd, the smartest soccer player Lenny had ever known. Danny had played drums with the best and could fake out opponents on the playing field with a seemingly effortless repertoire of slick moves. He played with Lenny's bride for a couple of months, then used her head as a punching bag after a night of coke and boozing. She could hardly keep her balance since her vertebrae was permanently damaged, and the beating left her with a shaky self-confidence and a self-esteem somewhere in the twilight zone. A couple of weeks later, she committed suicide. Well, for years, Lenny had thought of killing Danny. His body actually contracted with a weird feeling that ran up his spine every time the son of a bitch's name came up in conversation. You see his picture on a billboard for some new band every once in a while, or catch a glimpse of him turning a corner in his chicken shit green sports car. Danny had stayed in shape and prospered, as evil often does, coaching soccer to gullible kids and living the sport and life. The over-30 soccer game was just another opportunity for Danny Kidd to shine amongst his peers. His team never went down to defeat, usually making the competition look woefully inept. Well, Lenny Strauss put out his last cigarette in his darkened living room as his 15-year-old cat purred on his chest. "You're gonna pay big time, Danny Kidd," he thought to himself, as his hand curled into a fist and his eyes filled with tears of rage. The night of the game was foggy, with a chilling mist that seemed to beckon ghosts. The field was one of those barely tended community playgrounds just outside of Arcata in Manila. Lenny's team was called the Crackers and was composed of misfits who had been stupid enough to put love before gold. There were the Gainey brothers, Ted and Bobby, whose Irish grief over their sister's death in a plane accident made them stitch her name, Laureline, into their baseball caps, which they always wore backwards. Buck Mays, a Polish guy from Detroit whose wife suffered from a rare form of leukemia. And Duke Mongola, the big kid that played goalie, who'd been raised in orphanages and could stop anything that came in his direction. Well, the night before, the boys had got together for one last BS session. A little strategy and the kind of talk which defines friendship. "You know, Laureline was that special person who seemed to understand what makes me tick," Ted Gainey said to his teammates and his brother, who felt the same way. "How's the wife doing, Buck?" Bobby Gainey said to Buck as the Pogue sang "Summer in Siam." "Well, it's a bitch, Bobby. Nothing is harder than watching someone you love suffer and feeling helpless to alleviate their pain. Duke and Lenny just partied as they listened to their friends with all due respect. Duke smiling sadly at his teammates' grief. Lenny staring straight ahead as Shane MacGowan sang, "Some of them fell into heaven, some of them fell into hell." In a barely audible voice, he turned away from everyone in the little group and said, "This game's for you, kid." The Crackers were ready to take the field. Across the chalk-marked grass, coming out of the fog like plastic gods who had never tasted the richness of defeat, were the Golden Oldies, led by that little prick, Danny Kidd. Besides their golden shorts and T-shirts, the one thing the Oldies had in common was Kidd's ugly smirk, which smacked of the rawest form of scorn. At midfield, Lenny Strauss looked at the only man he had ever hated with blood in his eye. They squared off for control of the opening ball. "Photographs and memories, huh, Lenny?" Kidd said as his teammates laughed with greedy expectation. Lenny was stunned that Kidd would quote Jim Croce, who'd been his bride's favorite singer. Kidd used Lenny's momentary shock to slide the ball right by his slower competitor and deep into Cracker territory. The Gainey brothers and Buck Mays were both faked out by Kidd's incredible cunning, which stemmed from gifted athleticism. Showboating it down the sideline, Kidd had a patented shot that cut the corner of a goal like an ace in tennis, which he exploded to the only thing standing in front of his direction, Duke Mongola. Mongola stretched as he leapt in the air, batting the bullet back into play with a disregard for his own physical welfare, which made the Golden Oldies almost stop in their tracks. Regaining his feet quickly for such a big man, Mongola yelled out to some primal scream which seemed to change the opening momentum of the game. Taking the ball back into the Oldies' territory, Lenny found his wind coming harder and harder. He passed the ball with his right foot to Buck, whose strong legs put him squarely into position to score. Coming down on the ball with a strong kick, Buck sent the ball flying into the Golden Oldies' goal for a point, as Lenny Strauss made the first of many side tackles on Danny Kidd, whose golden outfit was going to turn into a muddy, bloody mess before the evening was over. For an hour, the Crackers and the Oldies battled it out like it was Gettysburg. The Golden Oldies driven by that hip razzle-dazzle self-assurance. The Crackers planting seeds of doubt which stemmed from their rugged love of the game that made them forget their sadness while exploiting the anger which lay dormant without competition. Mongola paraded back and forth on the goal line, at times drinking with 2 hands full of pale ale Sierra Nevada. His moves were still astounding, but his drunkenness was causing him to play with even more reckless abandon. Between the adrenaline of the game and the alcohol, Duke wouldn't feel much the next day when everybody else would also be sore. Ted Gainey, noticing his friend's crazy, self-destructive style, yelled something like, "Lighten up, Duke," to which Mongola unzipped his pants and urinated in response. For the first time in the game, Lenny laughed at Big Duke's defiance of even his own well-being. Then he vomited up his guts. You could say the Crackers were having a moment. The Gainey brothers ran over to Lenny, who was now choking and puking, concerned that maybe he'd pushed himself too far. Buck Mays wasn't too far behind as Lenny continued for a second with his head down, as snot ran out his nose. Lenny just lifted his head that was knotted with bumps from banging into Danny Kidd all night, and said softly through his nausea, "Never felt better." Mongola, who seemed almost glued to his post at the goal, screamed for his teammates to get back into action. "Come on, you mothers, let's play." And with Duke's voice pissing them off as much as anything else, the Crackers were back in the thick of the action. It was then that it happened. Danny Kidd, seeing the Crackers' exhaustion and Duke Mongola's progressively sloppy play at the goal line, made a run for his money. Charging past everyone on the field, his body aching, Danny Kidd mustered a kick on the ball which rammed into Duke Mongola's nose, breaking it soundly. At that point, one would have thought the Crackers were finished. Mongola rose slowly to his feet, his face crimson with blood. It was a fair kick, just the type of opportunistic move Danny Kidd had specialized in over the years. Well, one of Kidd's soccer students ran to call an ambulance, and it looked like the night might be coming to an end. Lenny ran over to his friend Mongola, who was still dazed but game. "Look, you drunken orphan piece of crap, I didn't come here to lose to Danny Kidd and the Golden Oldies, and you're going to finish this game whether it kills you or not." Staring down at his little buddy, Mongola said through the blood, "Did I say I was quitting?" The Golden Oldies had pretty much huddled and decided the game would end when Mongola broke his beak. Lenny walked over to Danny Kidd and his team of punks and said in his best Mickey Rourke whisper, "We're ready to resume play." The game was winding down to the final plane when the ambulance and cops pulled onto the premises. Danny Kid was again leading the pack towards Mongola, who now realized he was willing to die for this friggin' game. Kid usually had sharp peripheral vision, but he got pretty beat up himself tonight. And as he extended his muscular leg back for one last kick of the ball into Duke's defenseless face, Detroit Buck hit Kid so hard from the side that he twisted in motion towards the other force, which was coming slowly but surely from another direction. Lenny Strauss. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Lenny rammed into Danny Kid's twisting frame, sending him limp and unconscious. Seeing the bloody face of Mongola in the last play of the over 30 reunion soccer game was enough to make the cops draw their billy clubs as they approached the field, wondering what kind of game these guys were playing anyways. Slowly, Buck Mays and Lenny rose from the entanglement with the groaning Danny Kid, who probably had a concussion and a couple of broken ribs. They high-fived over the down-moaning leader of the Golden Oldies as the ambulance drivers tended to Mongola and prepared a stretcher for Kid. Still fighting nausea, the remaining crackers walked to the sideline in a subdued voice. Lenny a little behind the Guinea brothers and Buck. Unnoticed up to this time was the sweetest-looking little 15-year-old girl you'd ever seen with green hair. It was Dandelion, Lenny's daughter, who had watched the over 30 soccer reunion game, knowing full well the history of the players. She truly loved her father and hated to see the way his life had taken such a tormented twist. Smiling warmly, Lenny hugged his little girl with all the love he could muster. "Dad, you played a great game," she said, still astounded by the old man's passion. Kissing the top of her head gently through his own bloody nose and cracked lips, Lenny looked proudly at his teammates. "Dandelion don't tell no lies," Lenny Strauss said, feeling the sweetness of life for the first time in many years. You know, a lot of times bombs don't always go where they're supposed to go. See you next week in a brand new show. Hasta luego, amigos.
I still hear